So going back to this Shaivism, going back to this, because I'd like you to, I don't want to miss one person. I don't want to miss one person because then it will be a pity. How does that sit together here? The most important question in a way to solve is, who am I as an individual? Is it not? Or am I just overshooting myself and projecting my own interests of my life onto you? You know, maybe. I don't know. Maybe some of you are already thinking, what's going to be for lunch? Because breakfast wasn't really satisfying. I don't know, like what's happening at home, you know, like my dog being fed, my favorite cat, you know, what's my husband or wife doing? The children do a housework, you know, school. I mean, endless list of whatever the importance is. So I'm just wondering, maybe I am projecting, talking about philosophy, all that shit, you know, like, all this nonsense, unapplicable in our life. We want solutions, constant and life-solving solutions, because everything is perceived as some kind of thing to solve. But all I can share is my passion. So you basically have to stick with it for a number of days. So, and since, you know, the way it goes, it's better to be really clear about it and get going. But it seems to me that the question of who am I as an individual, always there, whether this is on the background or on at the forefront, and there are times in our lives when this question really presents itself in more acute manner than at other times. It can present itself in a variety of ways, and it can simply become the very, very matter of life and death. It can become one and the only riddle to solve. Certainly, if we are, astrologically speaking, guarded and guided, given the container, so in other words, we can't escape. Energy is already internalized, you know, like all this, like, oh yeah, you know, no, stay here, stay put, stay present. This is it. Face it. But so, do I have to? I mean, come on, like, no, this is what it is. And all of us know when this happens by itself, we know that there's no escape strategy anymore. We know that this is to face the show. This is to face ourselves. So the question of who we are, the question of individuality here becomes primal, central. So this, what is expounded here, not only solves that question, it positions the all-encompassing perspective where you can spend the rest of your life, I'm not exaggerating, to contemplate that and that alone. Not that you need to contemplate the equilateral and, you know, like, I'm saying you contemplate this in myriad of ways, and the ways are infinite. If only you tap into that understanding of what this represents. Because when we speak of seer, process of seeing, and that what is seen, which comprises the gamut of experience, this in itself is the expressive potentiality of your own awareness as who you are in that experience and what constitutes that experience. So this equilateral is a helpful geometrical structure which is at the heart of myriads of endless myriads of formations and forms. There's no yantra without triangle is being drawn. The famous Sri Yantra, the Sri Yantra, some of you might have seen that or will see that. I don't know if you are destined or meant to. You can perceive that pulsating form of these superimposed triangles that vibrate and emanate, and at each point of juncture, a point of crossing of these geometrical lines, it sparks as a specific quality of consciousness, as thatness of your existence, as all the 36 categories, these 36 categories of consciousness. That's what the world and I am is. Therefore, each and every one of us is that pulsating structure. So, this seer, seeing, seen, Shiva, Shakti, Nara, awareness, the power, and the individual. These are not independent modalities, nor they are interdependent modalities either. They are but expressions of your own awareness in its eagerness to know, and language will almost demand to say something itself. But that already is where language unveils only to shut down and conceal it. You see? The grammar of the language in itself, from tantric point of view, is the greatest limitation to the knowledge that language can unveil. So one of the most difficult things to do is to use and utilize the language for the sake of dismantling the limitation of the language. So therefore, there is this proposition to have clarity whilst at the very same time keep it all tentative. What does it mean, tentative? Means do not be attempted to put the last dot on I. Keep it fluid, because it's knowledge itself is a shimmering pool of sound, or a more maybe down-to-earth metaphor. It's the river that flows through various terrains. There's nothing that we can pin down. And yet, this understanding that seeing and seen are oneness, togetherness. Therefore, the Sanskrit term samyama, another Sanskrit term for you. Samyama, if you're taking notes, it's togetherness, together, at once. Samyama. In Vedic tradition, it is expressed as samyama of Rishi Devata Chandas. Samyama of Rishi Devata Chandas. Rishi stands for the seer, literally. Devata stands for the seeing as the process. And Chandas stands for the object, for the seen. So this togetherness in tantric language, spoken of in terms of this quality of Shiva, Shakti, and Nara. But all this is Shiva. So immediate adjustment is made. Individual here is not some kind of freak of evolution. Individual is awareness concealing itself in the experience of its own subjectivity as an object of its own perception. Awareness consciously undergoes, consciously now, look what I'm doing. Awareness as Shiva consciously undergoes through the power of its self-awareness as Shakti to the ultimate expression of itself as this limited being for the sake of its own concealment in the world of objective experience. That's what I meant. You can reflect on that for the rest of your life. For the rest of your life, this can be reflected on. I do. And I don't see the end to it. I don't see how there can be an end. And you know why? Because that's the whole point. That's the beauty of this philosophy in motion, that it doesn't give you, oh, final answer, all right, so got it. I've got more important things to do now. So the question of individual here is solved. Can you see or not? Resolved. Whether you are consider yourself enlightened or not, the tension, psychological distress, dilemma is pulled from under your feet. It's pulled. You have nothing to stand on. So in other words, let us not even pretend that there is a dilemma of how this individual me in relation to the rest of creation, in relation to whatever we may call it. It's not there in the first place. So therefore there are myriad of now ways, but then we begin to narrow down these ways of how to deal with that, and we will arrive at extraordinary realization that already the mere fact that I'm experiencing something, anything, irrespective of the quality of that experience, is unity in motion. In other words, unity never has suffered fragmentation. It's only perceived at a respective modality that awareness consciously prefers to have, so as to give that vintage point, the collapse of that what is beyond of the beyond of the beyond, that infinity itself, is only and can only be savored from a vintage point of view of time and space, which is the primal forces where individual is bound. It has to have these categories: spatial causation and that of time. All and everything else unfolds from there, proceeds from there. So as far as the perspective of this, what Kashmir Shaivism here proposes, unity and union is never broken. So therefore, the conversation about what to do with ego doesn't exist. Conversation about what to do with the mind, all right, if you want to go back to kindergarten, we can go back there. We can revisit it. You want to learn how to read again? Fine, let's do that. Nothing wrong with that. But if you already can read, why don't we enjoy poetry? So the poetry in the teaching in this, I find it's a poetic invocation of that ceaseless relationship. Seer, seeing and seen. Everything is subject to that. Everything is that. So the individual here is not me who somehow subject to its own calamity, subject to its own fragmentation. It is consciousness hidden as myself. It is the sacrifice. We can, those of you, let's say at least some of you, more or less familiar with this Vedic perspective, Vedic myth, the Prajapati, any of you, just out of curiosity, those of you who have ever heard of that Prajapati myth, can you raise your hand, please? Okay, wonderful. So the Prajapati myth, Prajapati is this primordial, primal being. And its totality, its fullness itself, its oneness. And yet within that oneness there is this, how can I know anything? How can I know myself if everything is homogeneously one? So this somehow, this is Vedic perspective. It's a Vedic myth. In the Rig Veda, there's a whole hymn to Prajapati. Purusha hymn comes from that. Lamentation of Prajapati brings forth a swelling power to know itself. But how can it know itself if it already won? How can it know itself if there are no parts to know? So, swelled with that great longing, it begins this awful sense of sacrifice. Awful, because that's how it's portrayed, because it has to undergo tremendous suffering. Because in that oneness, there's no predicament, no conflict, no pain, nothing. Whatever that is, it has no name. Whatever that is, it has nothing. Longing only. And even longing is what? Longing for what? And yet that longing swells and it willingly undergoes this self-dismembering. That's how the tradition speaks of it. It begins to blew itself out to pieces. It's blasted itself. It's a bloody picture. You imagine a whole being blown up to shreds that begin to expand as space-time and, bleeding, exploding as star galaxies, supernovas, this, that. It's just blast itself. Not like a Big Bang. Nah, none of that. And in that sacrifice, the Prajapati undergoes, this experience becomes a possibility. So the leitmotif of Vedic thought here, I'm taking this as a detour from the main discourse, so as to illustrate that, because they're linked. It's a reflection of what's happening at the level of the fragmented individual experience that is eager to know itself as totality, as wholeness. So the echo of that dismembering of Prajapati reverberates now here in the need to sacrifice that what is the result of the dismembering, result of fragmentation, a brutal act of self-emulation, needs to be healed, restored. How can it be restored? And the Vedic perspective here is that it requires another sacrifice. Therefore, the theme of sacrifice is central to Indian thought. The theme of sacrifice is the most central to all Indian systems of philosophy, all of them, irrespective. Even those who seem to be conflicting with what is the main emphasis. It seems like Buddha came to overthrow the domain of the caste of Brahmins sitting on the top of the hierarchical structure and to democratize the process. Or whether this is Jaini movement, anything that's born in the Indian subcontinent has that central quality, the quality of sacrifice. That sacrifice is what restores the original act of dismembering that Prajapati as totality of existence subjected itself to. And it can only be done through that willingness to sacrifice. And there are degrees, prescriptions, street code, ways of how. That term sacrifice, in Sanskrit is yagya. Yagya. You can translate it in a softer version, right? Milder version as an offering. But here, sacrifice and offering are used as synonymous terms. So yagya, and those of us who are familiar, those of you or us who are familiar with, let's say, the key text of the Vedas, the Bhagavad Gita, might remember and should remember how much is given to the yagya. In response to Arjuna's question, how can this be restored? The dialogue unfolds. Prajapati is not mentioned, don't worry. It's language is different, but the quest is the same. Language is more modern than Prajapati. It's an ancient myth. Belongs to the Upanishads, Puranas, Aranyakas. Bhagavad Gita considered to be a more modern work compared to the full body of Indian thought. The language is different, but the quest is the same. So in response to Arjuna pressing on what is, Krishna, as the manifestation of the Absolute in this conversation, begins to expand on the yagyas. And remember the verses, these beautiful verses, really impressed. I was impressed in the way, impressed into the crevices of my being, of my mind, like some perform it by way of restraining the breath, some perform it in the form of duty, some perform it in the form of offering, some perform it in terms of offering of their possessions, some perform it in terms of offering into the fire of oblation. Different yagyas, different forms of offering, elaborately and articulately expounded on. But the essence here is that to restore unity to that what has dismembered itself out of self-swelling desire to know becomes the very leitmotif of human life, job to be done. Whatever jobs we might think, Indian civilization is adamant. Conquests came and left, this, that colony, that, this. Central quest was always there, remained, passed on. This is the term dharma. The true definition of dharma here is, and can be narrowed down to sacrifice. There's no dharma without sacrifice. As Mahatma Gandhi said, there's no religion without sacrifice. The word religion doesn't exist in Indian language. The word dharma exists in Indian language. So that's what he meant. He just spoke it in English language for the access of the Western audiences. There's no religion that what unites without sacrifice. He simply spoke in line with the civilizational ethos of culture. So this sacrifice, ultimately speaking, now these different degrees, right? You can hear that. Some perform it in the form of possessions, let's say placed at birth, maybe at the top of the pyramid of the social structure, right? Back in the day, all these rajas, all this wealthy crust of society. Their job, duty is to offer support. And so it goes. Those who give themselves to spiritual practice, the practice of yoga, pranayama, all this variety of methodologies. The verse, restraining the breath, that's what it means. Those who perform yaga in the form of offering oblations into the fire, all these fire worshippers, all this offering, But ultimately speaking, esoterically speaking now, this is an offering of the most precious. And what is the most precious? Breath. Well, you could say that, yes. But it's life force. It's life force. So in other words, life force here is that what gives the expression to our individuality. Life force is what allows the possibility of individual experience. So ultimately speaking, the restoration of unity is through the willing act of offering one's individual existence back into where it belongs. So that's what restores Prajapati. This is at least a Vedic line of thought. Take it or leave it, you see? So, and of course you can then see echoes and you can see analogies, you can see these analogies, down to the famous Rumi's explanation that I often like to cite. Out of compassion this existence is given to you. Out of compassion, give it back. That's what it represents. So we can see this here. This Vedic myth, this Vedic leitmotif of the Prajapati, the progenitor, going through that dismembering and self-mutilation in order for the multiplicity to take place. That multiplicity is healed through an act of willing self-offering. You see? So we have a full picture, a full picture of culturally shared consensus. So this is, in a way, to understand the civilization from that point of view. This is also to understand why some philosophers today will be ridiculed and made into personas non gratas, because they speak about uniqueness of certain expressions exist in certain cultures, so that we don't just somehow be all brushed by the same measure of the so-called maybe collectively now chosen values of, prevalent values, right? There's democracy. Democracy, right? What is the full name of that democracy? Liberal democracy? Thank you. Liberal democracy now is what everyone has to embrace, because according to civilizational consensus, we're going to war for that. We're going to bomb Iraq to ruins because they do not adhere to liberal democracy. Thankfully, there are no ideas to bomb India, but the Ukraine is being bombed in the name of liberal democracy. It's bombed by Russians, but why? Because it fits the collectively shared consensus. Because liberal democracy is an idea, it's an ideology to adhere to. It's the highest, a pinnacle of our civilization, according to some authors. They call themselves philosophers. In my vocabulary, they're not philosophers. They're propagandists, populists, salesmen. I'll keep other epithets to myself. So the liberal democracy is a blanket, an umbrella, a cover. And we will go into war for that. We will go into war. We ridicule the Allah Akbar, we ridicule that. Oh, fanatics. But to me personally, who grew up hearing namaz 5 times a day in the old town of Tashkent, it doesn't sound fanatical. And it has, forgive me, and now you can really, really see what a mess you'll let yourself into this immersion. To me, it has more integrity. The Allah Akbar has more integrity than hearing the speeches of very, very eloquently spoken, well-dressed men or women where liberal democracy is a license to go and take, bomb, convert, because this is the collectively shared values, and someone decided that that's what everyone needs to embrace. So of course someone like Alexander Dugin will be called a fascist philosopher. It's a convenient way of dismissing the complexity of cultural identity. So this sudden detour is to show you that we're not here to discuss dry philosophical concepts irrelevant to our time, irrelevant to our lives. All is interconnected, intricately linked together. See? And the indoctrination is profound. Those who have been one among their most reverent followers for many years, when they heard me expressing myself in very direct and often unapologetic manner on these matters, immediately became most reverent critics that cannot tolerate anything I say. And they see everything as being already somehow colored by cultural biases. And yet I feel that spiritual dialogue no longer can remain in safe trenches, right, or bunkers, unexposed to the reality of what we all now facing, living. So taking it all back to that, where is my place? To me, this feels not just because I don't want to say that this is a solution. It's a wrong way to look at it. Understanding of the relationship of what really affords the possibility of this experience of being human is offered here with pristine clarity. Because Shiva Shakti Nara here is indivisible reality of who I am as experience. Therefore, the question of individual no longer poses itself. It becomes obsolete. So it's not like one day I will say I am God. I am God doesn't need to be even said anymore, because it expressed in the purity of I amness here. And every experience is made out of that. If reflected upon, it brings tremendous sense of peace and serenity to that fragmented experience of considering oneself to be an independently living body, independently living organism. And this is important because from here we will proceed into the alchemical domain of what is happening deep within the psyche of each and every one of us, so as to rehabilitate human experience. Because here human experience will be given complete and utter congruency with nothing other than divine expression of who we are at each and every moment, irrespective of how it feels at the surface level of affairs. So, to conclude this, and I'm already running out of time, this in relation to, if you want to understand, so Shiva, Shakti, Nara, all right, okay, so awareness, the power of self-awareness, that the power of gnosis, and individual, which is myself, that I consider, and the world. Right? So how do they relate? They don't. You see? They don't relate. They are one. Just like experience. This is one experience. There is no such thing to separate the observer from the process of observation and that which is being observed. Try to do it. You cannot. It's seamless. It's marvelous. It's seamless. It's marvelous. You cannot separate that for a moment. Why? Because observer is observed, or observed is the observer. And how is this steadfasted? Through the observing. The observer is I, the centrality of your awareness. The act of observing is the power, your own power, inseparable from the I. And that what is being observed is the marvel of my own power to recognize myself in the objective experience of who am I. So it restores the sanctity to every experience. Every experience no longer just experience. Every experience is unity in motion. Every time our senses unite with the object of perception, it's an act of union. What talks about individuality? It doesn't even have place to enter. So this is integral perspective. So that the shift, energy is freed from getting in a what is it? Gridlock? Getting out of that gridlock. You know, like how many generation upon generation of seekers stuck at the gridlock of my own poor little ego. What do I do with that? Doesn't exist in Kashmir Shaivism. What exists instead is pure subjectivity, universal egoity. So already one withdrew oneself completely, utterly and entirely. One doesn't already exist there, but from a different point of view than how non-duality speaks about it. Can you see? And this is where it's very, very similar in the perspective of the Sufi teachings on the nature of individual experience, on the nature of that. Very similar. So, I will conclude this discourse with just 3 paths only. I welcome us to get back there anytime, please, to elaborate more. But I just want to have these conclusive remarks to bring us where we were dived into. So it offers 3 paths. 3. For obvious reasons. The path of Shiva, the path of Shakti, and the path of individual. The path of Shiva is the supreme path. And the only methodology here is aham. There's no other methodology. The only methodology on the path of Shiva is aham. I am. It's the continuous reverberation of the mantra at the heart of every experience. It's, if you will, the tantric analogy to the process of self-inquiry, but that is a kind of concession of the Vedantists, because that's not done in the same way here. The aham is a principle here which encompasses, as you have already heard, through the letters, as that vowel of A for Shiva, consonant of Ha for Shakti, and reverberating sound of M. M is that sound that is left out of that power of the union of Shiva and Shakti. Everything that is experienced here, at any planes of existence, is the resonance of that union. Everything is the resonance of that union. That's what here M represents. So that's the path of Shiva. One has to be already, one's consciousness has to reach the level of exaltation to be able to walk that path, to work at that level. When we speak about means or pious, we will come back to that. The path of Shakti is the path of visceral unfoldment and ascent of consciousness as Kundalini. It's being in the domain of Shakti, literally, not metaphorically. The path of Shakti here represents the path of the transformation of consciousness. It's the path of Gnosis. Gnosis here, not reading the books, please try to understand. Gnosis here, not knowledge in the sense of how we used to understand that. It's a continuous cognition. That's what Gnosis starts for. Gnosis. Greek Gnosis is Gyan. Gyan of the Sanskrit. Gyan is a process of cognition. Can you hear traction there? In the language, in the sound. Gyan. Gyan. Just like in Latin, ignus. That's the same friction. Zippo. Then you warm up your favorite, right? Lovingly. That's the only possible because there's a friction that gave rise to fire. That's what Gnosis here. So the path of Shakti is that. That's what the path of Shakti truly here represents. Is that what is ignited here and unfolds as the flame of your own awareness that takes you all the way. And the path of individual, which incorporates into itself the full gamut of all spiritual methodologies and teachings available. Everything, we can say, just using every nook and cranny. Do you know that expression? Not everyone is. Nook and cranny. Yeah? So that's what individual path. All the gamut of yogic, all the in asanas, pranayamas, and all this. Everything. Mantras, this visualization. Everything. So that's what individual path here comprises. And I will leave now a suspense, hopefully to return so as to look into superiority versus inferiority, so no wrong ideas enter the mind. If someone suddenly thinks, oh, am I which one? Do I qualify? Like us to go back to this, to clarify. But if those of you who already followed me attentively enough, in equilateral, all sides are equal. In equilateral, all sides are equal. You turn it each way, it's equal, it remains equilateral. So let that be there as that healthy suspense.